in front of the place where that condo is. I would walk on the street and then walk back with her, and they had Katie's child, something like that. And so he walks down one way and he goes, "Now, do I have to be the same size so the continuity is the same?" And I said, "But actually, we'll only use one or the other." But that, I'm glad you. My name is Stephen J. Abramson. Today is October 15th, 2008, and I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing producer Barney Rosenzweig. We are in North Hollywood, California, at the headquarters of the TV Academy, and this is for the archive of American television. So, as I said, we'll start it right at the beginning, and let me ask you, what was your name at birth?
That's an interesting question, actually. My name was Barney Rosenzweig, except on the birth certificate it says Bernard. And I didn't know that until I got my first passport when I was an adult. I called my mother and I said, "Do you know that my name is Bernard and that I have a middle name?" And she said, "It is not Bernard. Your name is Barney and you have no middle name." Well, of course, I did. I think it was a combination of things. In the old days, I am an old guy. If you went in and said, "I want my son to be named Jack," they automatically put down John. If you said his name is Tom, they put down Thomas. I mean, they had a tendency to formalize everybody's name. So I suspect that's what it was with Barney and Bernard. How I got to the middle name Michael, I do not know. I've never used it except for this moment, and it's not on my passport. It's not on my my college diploma or on my Emmy or Emmys, but it is on my birth certificate.
When and where were you born?
East Los Angeles, California.
And when?
December 23rd, 1937.
Where did you grow up?
In East LA, Montebello, the east side of Los Angeles. Went to public school there, and then ultimately matriculated to the University of Southern California, where I graduated with a bachelor's degree in political science. Well, actually, in those days it was just liberal arts, but I was a poli-sci major and a history minor, graduating in 1959.
What was your father's name?
My father's name was Aaron Benjamin Rosenzweig. He was also born in East Los Angeles, and which was rare for someone of his generation. He was a school teacher, Garfield High School, North Hollywood High, and Pierce College here in the Valley. He was revered in our neighborhood as a music teacher because music is an international language. And the Hispanic kids who frequented Garfield High School might be failing in history lessons or in English lessons or in other classes. But music being an international language, they succeeded there. Their natural intelligence came to the fore. And so the parents were always thrilled with the success of their children in my father's classes. And my father, long before Leonard Bernstein did it, used to stand up in front of his motley little crew of an orchestra and turn to the audience and explain what it was they were playing and talk about the history of the music and all that stuff. He was quite an interesting character and very, very popular in our hometown.
What about your mother? What was her name?
My mother's name is Myrtle. Myrtle Lieber was actually, her legal name was Myrtle Eichenthal. Lieber was her stepfather's name. And my mom was what we would call today, I think, clinically depressed. But, she was a good mom. I mean, but she just didn't do things like go to the beauty salon or go to a store to buy clothes. She cut her own hair like that, and very rarely left the house. I was a performer in school. I was a kid who was the MC of all the shows, who did some singing, who did some stand-up comedy routines, who did a lot of drama shows, and she never went. And so I would have to come home at night. That was okay, because when I came home, she knew she'd see the performance because I'd do it all over again for her. It's an interesting story, and I like to tell it only because years later, when it was time for me to go to college, I received a couple of scholarships in the dramatic arts, one from the Art Institute of Chicago and one from Redlands University. I think that was a half scholarship. I didn't want to go to Redlands, but I did want to go to the Art Institute of Chicago, and my mother didn't want me to go. she was a person who was afraid of things. She didn't go outdoors, so she was afraid of me leaving the state. She wanted me to stay. She had undue influence on me in that regard, and I was pissed about it. And so I sort of punished her. She said, you can go anywhere you want to go as long as it's in California. Los Angeles, I think. She was really specific. So there were two choices, really, it was UCLA and USC, and I picked USC. First of all, I was a USC football fan in those days, and secondly, it was more expensive than UCLA, and I was going to punish her for this decision to keep me from going to Chicago. Well, my dad was a public school teacher and couldn't possibly afford USC. So my mother had her mother make her a dress. She cut her hair, washed her face, and went out and got a job and put me through college.
What did she do?
She worked for the Human Resources and Development, the Department of Unemployment, in the city of Los Angeles, in East Los Angeles on Indiana Street. And, so there I was at 17, not willing to be thrown out into the world myself, so I threw my mother out into it. But I think it's remarkable for a woman who had her handicap to have just steeled up her backbone and went out and did that. And then she put me through school, and then she put my younger brother through school as well. Both of us went to USC.
Do you have one sibling?
I have one sibling, my brother Joel, who is a director, now a school teacher in Texas, but he has directed film and television in the past, including Cagney and Lacey, and including The Trials of Rosie O'Neill, two of my shows, and others as well.
When you were growing up, you mentioned performing. Was that something you always wanted to do? Did you have hobbies, or was everything sort of oriented to you at that time, wanting to be a performer?
I think that being a performer was my primary thing. I wasn't very mechanical. I wasn't good with my hands. I wasn't a carpenter or a fisherman or I didn't learn any of the manly arts. My father was a musician, and I couldn't learn an instrument to the level of my own satisfaction. I believed then, I believe now, but I'm not sure it's true, that I had perfect pitch. I know that I could sit in the back of the LA Philharmonic, which in those days was a very large hall, and I could tell if the second violinist was slightly out of tune or if somebody had hit a wrong note. However, just off pitch. And I couldn't stand to hear myself practice. Couldn't stand the sound of it. I wanted to play the violin the way Jascha Heifetz played the violin, but you have to practice to do that, and I couldn't do that. And so I never really learned. And my father was impatient with me. And my father could teach everybody else's kid how to do it. He couldn't teach me. He broke a lot of small violins over my rear end in the old days. Somebody today would call it a child abuse. It wasn't, but there was corporal punishment, and it usually came out of his fit of temper. My inability to grasp the simple act of playing the violin. I also tried the trombone and the clarinet, and I mean, I really was passionate about it. I wanted to do it. I just couldn't pull it off, something I couldn't do. So but the point is that that's what he tried to teach me. He didn't try to teach me to fish. He didn't try to teach me to hunt. He didn't try to teach me how to make furniture. So I didn't learn any of those things. I'm not a very handy guy to have around, There probably is a special joke about how many guys it takes to put in a light bulb if one of them is Barney Rosenzweig. So, but we haven't come up with that one yet. At any rate, I had no hobbies, but I was good on my feet. I was glib, and I was a show-off, unembarrassed, if you will, and able to stand up in front of a crowd and pull off whatever needed to be done. I was once told by a teacher of mine in the public school system, I overheard them say to my parents, Barney has an interior compass. You put him in front of an audience, and within minutes, he finds true north. He knows who to play to, what part of the group there is. And I think there's some truth to that. I'm very comfortable in front of an audience. And those things I think I do well. And it served me well over all my life. Even in show business, Of course, I mean, obviously would, but I mean in obvious ways. Because I was so comfortable in my own ability to communicate and my own ability to charm an audience of one or more, it led me to be very comfortable with the press. And so I had one of these kind of relationships. I could talk in sound bites. And I had one of these relationships with the newspapers and the television reporters that made me very quotable, made me someone they wanted to call up, so that when there was a story about the industry, when there was a story about something going on in town, a strike or a larger issue than just a simple show, or where 5 or 6 shows would be mentioned as a trend, invariably it was me and my show that was in the lead of the story. 95% of the time, it was odd that I would be buried in the story. I would be up there at the top. So it helped me. It was helped me and helped my shows.
When do you remember the first time that you actually saw television, watched something on television?
Yeah, I remember pretty well. In 1948, I was getting ready to turn 11 years old at the end of 1948, and my folks bought a television set, and we were the first one in the neighborhood. It was an Admiral, and it was a 10-inch black and white set. It came in a large console. My dad, of course, musician that he was, wanted not only a very good radio and television, but he wanted a stereo system, a record player, and we didn't have DVDs and stuff in those days. So this was a large piece of, remember it was a sort of blonde mahogany, Philippine mahogany kind of furniture, major piece of furniture. And it cost a lot of money. I mean, it had probably represented months of my father's salary. I don't know how they possibly afforded it. My parents were not people, because they were Depression babies. They never really borrowed money. But they may have in this case. This may have been the first time that they actually went into debt to buy something. We had the first one. And I remember it, the best thing I remember about it was it being against the wall of our living room. A living room that was tiny. It was an 1,100 square foot house at best. And so the living room this was 2 bedrooms, so the living room was not very, very big. And most of the room being filled with all the neighbors on New Year's Day, 1949. And people standing on the front porch looking through the window to see the Rose Parade on television. And if you can imagine people standing 20 or 30 feet away to look at a 10-inch screen in flickering black and white, I mean, it boggles the mind. I mean, how far all this has progressed since my childhood. But I was 11, and I remember, obviously, that story pretty well.
When you first really got into entertainment as a business, did you have any connections?
Yes, I did. I married a young lady by the name of Joanne Lang my senior year in high school, just after turning 21 years of age. And she was the stepdaughter of Aaron Rosenberg. Aaron Rosenberg was a successful motion picture producer and a client then of MCA, which was even then a very prominent, then was a prominent agency. Today it's not, it's no longer existent. But then it was, along with William Morris, the largest agency in the business at that time. And I was a showman. I was a guy I was the head cheerleader at USC. I was out there. I was a guy who was in front of an audience all the time. I was getting written up by all the Hollywood press. Luella Parsons wrote about me. Hedda Hopper wrote about me because of what I did in the Coliseum every Saturday, and because I was marrying into the business. So I was legitimate show business material, as well as being written about in the sports sections of the papers. Jim Murray wrote a piece referring to me in Sports Illustrated, and there were others in the Herald Examiner and the Los Angeles Times at the time. So I had that in. And I did want to get into show business. I decided that's what I wanted to do. I had been interested, as most of my generation that wasn't going to go on to graduate school, in a career in public relations. That was the catch-all career for a young guy going to college. And I read a book. Well, two things happened. One was that I was interviewed a lot. In those days, major corporations would come to the campuses of the country to interview the top kids in the senior class for corporate America. And I was clearly one of those kids. I was one of the, if you interviewed 5 kids at USC, I was one of the 5 kids that got interviewed. And I wanted to be in PR. And I kept getting turned down. And I thought it was odd. I was perfect for Procter & Gamble, I thought. I mean, I couldn't understand why I didn't get that job. I didn't particularly want to go to wherever it was. Cincinnati, right. Cincinnati, where their home offices was. But, you know, I was willing to do it if I had to. And I didn't get the job. And I got suspicious after a while. And so I filled out an application to Procter & Gamble with the same stuff that I had already told them about. Only I put my roommate's name on it, Dan Cassidy. And Dan Cassidy got the job. And so it became clear to me that, you know, if you're Jewish in 1959 and you want to be in public relations in Cincinnati, Ohio, you got to be able to join the country club. And you couldn't in 1959 do that. And so there were problems. And I thought, well, I don't want to, I'm not swimming up this stream. You know, I'm just not doing that. I'd confronted anti-Semitism on and off all of my life. And I had beaten it at USC. And I wasn't going to go through it again. And so I thought, well, where am I going to go that's not going to, and I thought, well, I could go into show business, because in show business it's not only not a liability, it could be an asset. So I went to my father-in-law, or soon-to-be father-in-law, and I talked to him about that. And my then mother-in-law said, well, we'll get you a job at MCA. You know, I mean, they're Aaron's ages, they'd love you. You'd be terrific there. You'll love it. It'd be great. You get to wear a tie, and, you know, I was sort of a clothes horse. And so I interviewed at MCA. And the guy said, look, we have a policy against nepotism. Very strong policy. But, you know, this is sort of down the line nepotism. You're married yet to Aaron's daughter, and Aaron's a client. He's not, you know, one of us. And you seem like a nice young fella, and we'll give you a shot. So I was sent down to meet the guy who ran the mailroom at MCA. The way everybody started at MCA was in the mailroom. You learned your job in the mailroom. It was $60 a week, and you learned the business there, and you gradually worked your way up through the industry. And MCA was, as I said, the ultimate, with the possible exception of William Morris, the ultimate career stop for anybody interested in managing in the or that end of show business. I wasn't sure I was interested in that end of show business, but, you know, it was an opportunity. So the guy met me, and he said, okay, you start Monday. I said, wait a minute, I can't start Monday. Why not? I said, well, I'm in college. I don't graduate till June. I said, you know, my parents went through a lot to put me into school and to pay for my education. I can't say to them I'm leaving in my senior year before graduation to take a job for $60 a week. I mean, $60 a week in 1959 was not a lot of money even then. You know, it was a stipend. I had, for instance, as the head yell leader at USC, I'd been offered $1,500 a year at Equitable Life Insurance Society. I mean, they thought I was a born life insurance salesman. You know, probably true, and probably would have made a lot more money doing that than I ever did in show business. But I just said, I can't do this. I can't do this with my family. The guy looks at me like I'm crazy. I mean, these opportunities apparently came up once, maybe twice a year. He says, look, I need somebody Monday. There's a job opening on Monday. You're not going to take it. It's going to be filled by somebody else. He says, I'll put you down for June. He says, but I don't know when that'll be open. I said, well, there's nothing else I could do. And I thanked him, and that was the end of that. So now I'm out looking for jobs. And I'm interviewing for jobs, and they're not easy to come by. A lot of people in show business knew who I was. USC was the default entertainment on the weekends, USC football, as it is today in Los Angeles. And I was very prominent in that scene. We may talk about that later in this interview. But
So you didn't end up in the mailroom, it doesn't sound
No,
like.
well, I didn't. I had put in, one day I got a phone call from a pal of mine at USC, the head of the athletic news department, and said, Barney, MGM called. They're looking for somebody to go into PR at MGM. I know you don't want to do that anymore. He says, but I thought I'd tell you about it. I said, yeah, thanks. I ran down there. And I met the guys who were interviewing for apprentice publicist at MGM Studios. And I said, look, I'll be honest with you. I no longer want to be in public relations. I want to be in show business. So this is an opportunity to get inside the gate, and I mean, I'll work hard, and and the guy says, look, we're hiring publicists. That's what we're hiring. He says, he says, I don't know anything more about you than if you don't want to do that. He says, we'd hire you for that. He said, if you're not going to do that, he said, I'll tell you what, you seem like a nice kid, we'll put you in the mailroom. It was $50 a week. It's a come down from the 60, and there is no program, by the way. Right. There is no program, but MGM was just, it was just a job delivering the mail and sweeping the floors. I took it. I figured it'll get me inside the gate. I'll figure out what to do, and that's how I did it. So it was a magic mailroom, though. A lot of guys. Pete Peterson, who formed Motor Trend magazine, was in that mailroom before me. Guy McElwain, who went on to become the head of a studio and run his own publicity department before running a studio, was in that mailroom. There were a lot of us that graduated from that mailroom.
So the timing worked out. You were able to graduate from college before you got
this
your
interview
job.
took place in the summer.
Right.
It took place in the summer, yeah.
So then what was your first job in television?
My first job in television was as a producer. I started at the top. Daniel Boone with Fess Parker. I produced the last 78 episodes.
Now, how did you go from, where was the gap between mailroom and MGM to being a producer at Daniel Boone?
Big. Okay, it happened fast.
Okay.
I had a meteoric rise at MGM. And you want this in detail? How it happened? You want the steps? How it happened? I was in the mailroom. Recent graduate of the University of Southern California, the Yell King of the University of Southern California. Arguably the most popular man on campus, the guy who I traveled with the football team at the university's expense. I was Mr. USC. A large meeting is being held in the boss's office at MGM in that summer, the end of that summer, that first summer I was there in the mailroom. The man had a massive office. His name was Howard. Now a character in fictional movies about Hollywood, but he was a legend in his time. And for a lot of good reasons. Fascinating man. Movie star handsome, Clark Gable's best friend, head of a giant communications division, and he stuttered. I mean, he could not complete a sentence. How ironic, this guy who had led this vast communications empire could not himself speak in a coherent sentence without having to really fumble badly. But amazing man, powerful. And we were all in his office to discuss, and I was there plastered against the wall, the last, most insignificant guy in the room. And they're talking about the trouble they're having on this movie premiere, this big picture that's going to, the fortunes of which the entire studio's fortunes are hung. The success or failure of this movie will decide whether MGM goes forward or whether MGM closes its doors. And they have a charity premiere coming up in Los Angeles, and the charity is not doing a good job. They're not cooperating. They're not doing their share. They're not getting the press going the way they should. It's all movie stuff. We need more off the movie page material. And who is the charity? The medical school of the University of Southern California. And I raised my hand to the back of my head. Excuse me, sir. I know the president of the university, and I think I can be of some help here. All eyes turned to me, and I wound up handling what turned out to be the premiere of a picture called Ben-Hur, which went on to win 11 Academy Awards. I ran the whole West Coast campaign. Los Angeles was the largest single engagement of the film anywhere in the world, and I had I had chariot races in the Coliseum. At halftime, Ben-Hur cart stunts. The reason Tommy Trojan wears that, the original outfit he wore was that on the horse was the Charlton Heston's or one of the extras costumes from Ben-Hur. I was made overnight. And suddenly found myself as a publicist at MGM, which was the job I didn't want in the first place. But I was very hot. And immediately thereafter, there was a strike by the actors, and it was a serious strike. When the actors go on strike, everything stops. You know, with writers go on strike, there's still scripts in-house. If directors go on strike, well, somebody says, well, my cousin can direct. If actors go on, you got nobody to shoot. So the studio really did shut down, and everybody got laid off. And everybody but four of us. One guy, the top guy, was sent to Europe to do whatever he had to do. There were still movies to be released. And they brought me in. They said, Barney, you're now a publicist. You're doing other things. But if you'll go back to your old job and do your new job and run Ben-Hur, you can stay. And mostly because I was the cheapest guy there. I mean, I was still making less money than anybody. So I did. That's what I did. And I became a sort of a celebrity in that field. In those days, every major columnist, Luella Parsons, Hedda Hopper, Mike Connolly, Army Archer, Harrison Carroll, all those guys and gals, each had their own publicist connection with the studio. We were competing with our fellow publicists to get items to our contact. Now all those people were gone. And I became the publicist that handled all of them and had to deal with them fairly, competitively, figure out, well, this is more your kind of material than their kind of material, and got away with it. To the point where when the strike was over, and my boss called Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons and said, good news, the strike is over. And they said, no, we want the kid. Keep the kid on. But he's handling it's okay, we don't care. So I would have dinner with Hedda Hopper on Tuesday nights and be over at Luella's house on Wednesdays. I mean, I was that guy in that Tony Curtis character in The Sweet Smell of Success. That's what I was doing. And I hated it. And I wanted to get out. And so I figured out the way to do that. And I was making a ton of money, by the way. By this time, they were giving me raises every time I turned around. I was making more money than any publicist at MGM. I was, my boss just kept saying, Barney, he says, I'm going to give you a raise. He says, it'll never be enough for you.
And you were doing this for quite a long time, right?
I was a couple of years at this point, yeah. It had worked out. This was now, I'd gone there in 1959. This is now early 60, this is 62, 63. And I thought if I could ingratiate myself with the producer, I could latch onto that guy, do a great campaign for him, and he'll hire me away and take me under his wing. And I will trade my publicity skills for his teaching me how to be a producer. Because what I had discovered was that there was no lateral movement at MGM, as there was not at any studio. You could rise to the very top of your department. You could become the biggest star in whatever department you were in, but you could not move laterally. It was a studio policy all throughout the industry because they wanted to prevent department heads from raiding other departments. They wanted to keep that internecine warfare down to a minimum. I could go nowhere at MGM. I had to get out of MGM. And so I got a job with Marty Ritt, who was then a very, very successful, just off of HUD, very successful American television film director. And it's a long story, which I don't know that you care to hear about, but anyway, I succeeded, sort of. And then the offer was tempered, and I had to make a decision about whether to go to Europe with Marty and move my wife and family there, or whether to take a job with my then father-in-law to become his associate producer, which was all I really ever wanted to do. Not with him, but I wanted to learn to be an associate producer at 20th Century Fox. So here was my opportunity to get out of Fox, out of MGM rather, out of publicity, exactly the job I wanted, exactly the training ground I wanted. But the negative factors were that I have to give up 2 years of a great time with Marty Ritt in Europe and work for my father-in-law and be a participant in very heavy nepotism. That was a big factor for me. My ego was such, I didn't want anybody, I didn't want my career tainted with that. I didn't want to, Marty Ransoff, I remember, advised me, kid, don't do the job, you're going to, you don't want to be anybody's wart. So there was that possibility. And also, Aaron and I, as father-in-law and son-in-law, were not a great match. His wife and my wife had issues, mother and daughter issues, and we defended our spouses. So we were in a lot of wars a lot of the time about, who was right and who was wrong. And I was a fresh kid, and he was not only a successful film producer, he was a former two-time All-American football player at USC. He was a big guy and physical, and menacing in some ways.
But we're in the early 60s still, right? And
This is they were very early 60s.
Okay.
So I bit the bullet and I went to work for him.
Okay.
Aaron was in the film business. He had a television series called Daniel Boone. And it was being run by a guy by the name of Georgie Sherman. Georgie Sherman was a one-time successful director of John Wayne movies, of action films, and a good little guy. And I say little advisedly. He was the size of a jockey. And a great friend of Rosie's. And I had concentrated on the film business. I wasn't interested in television. I would go occasionally to the dailies on Daniel Boone. I thought it was just awful stuff. And I tried to muffle my attitude about it.
Was it a popular show?
Modestly. It was popular enough to be picked up for 3 years in a row at that time before I became involved with it. I took over the show in its fourth year, so it was popular enough. But it was always, second tier. It was always in the top, maybe in the top 40, but never in the top 20, never in the top 10, rarely in the top 20. It was not a high rating show. But in those days, the philosophy of television was if it has an audience, leave it on. It'll find more people as we go along. It was good counter-programming to what ABC and CBS were doing in its day. And it led into it was the lead-in for all the shows on NBC on Thursday night. And Thursday night was the only night that NBC won. So yes, it was a popular show. It was not a hit, but it was a popular show. I sort of made fun of it, but I tried to keep my attitude quiet, but I wasn't good at that. So it was known by the people at Daniel Boone that this kid, Aaron's son-in-law, thought it was low-class material.
But as your first TV show, did it serve to be a learning tool for you?
Well, no, it wasn't my first TV show at the time I'm talking about. This time I'm doing movies for Aaron.
Okay.
I'm doing an associate producer job.
Right.
And I put together a movie. And when I say I put together, I found the book. I co-wrote the final draft because the writer died, having delivered the first draft and the first half of the second draft. And I got the script to the star that made it happen through my friend Jim Mahoney from my MGM days. It was Frank Sinatra. And the movie was about to happen, called Tony Rome with Frank Sinatra. And the next thing I knew, having done all this work and thinking that my reward was going to be, kid, it's your movie, run with it. I was suddenly said, okay, we don't need you anymore now, we're going off to make the movie, sit here and run the office. Well, I was outraged. And I went to my boss, my father-in-law, with whom I'd had a great experience, by the way. All my fears of how we were going to get along were trivialized. Were minimal. We're not realistic, to say it more clearly. He was a fabulous teacher. And 90% of what I know about film and television, I learned from him. In many ways, I am him now. I've adopted so many of his mannerisms and so many of his, so much of who he was. This could almost be, in some ways, I think, from my point of view, an archive of Aaron Rosenberg as well. He was a great mentor to me, and a gruff guy, but I loved him. But I was outraged at my treatment at this moment. I was 28 years old, and I walked into his office and I quit. And he said, "What are you talking about?" I told him what my frustration was, what my outrage was, and he said, "You are a fool." And I said, "Well, that may be, but if this is the payoff for all the work I've done, then this is not the business for me. I'm going to find something else to do." And he said, "Well, how much notice, how soon do you want to leave?" I said, "Well, you're going off on location scouts for 2 weeks. I'll stay here while you're gone, run the store, and I'll be here for 2 weeks after that to turn everything over. So a month, how's that?" He said, "Okay." And I walked out the door, and I went down to the commissary at Fox, sat down with my friend, another associate producer, at lunch, and I said, "I just quit a $35,000 a year job like it was a paper route. I just did it. It was just impulsive and stupid, but I did it. And now I'm working in the place, and one of my jobs during those 4 weeks was to finalize negotiations with Georgie Sherman on Daniel Boone. Georgie did not want to stay without becoming a partner. He wanted a piece of the action. And I called, Rosie called me up and said, "How are things going with Georgie?" And I told him what I just said. He said, "Fuck him, you take the job." I said, "Oh, Rosie," I said, "you and Georgie will pass." He said, No, you're ready, you take the job. I'll pay you $1,000 a week." Well, $1,000 a week was a substantial increase over the $35,000 a year I had been making. That was a lot of money in 1967. And this conversation, I think, took place either in late 1966 or early 1967. I said, "You guys," he says, no. He says, you do it. So I started to think about it. And I read the material. My wife was very excited, of course. I mean, this meant she could get new drapes. I mean, it was a big deal. And I went to her. I remember she was in her dressing room, and I threw the script at her feet. And I said, "You read this. If you still want me to do this when it's over, when you've read it, I'll do it." She read the script. An hour or so later, she read 2 scripts, and she came out to see me, and she said, "They're awful," she says. "And if you don't want to do it, I understand." So she was very supportive, always. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to treat this like it's Republic Studios and it's 1935. I'm going to learn how to make Westerns cheap. I'm going to learn how to make movies on a budget. I don't know anything about television. I just know it's fast, and I know it's cheap, and I'm going to figure out how to do it. I didn't have a clue how to make a television show. I thought I knew how to make movies, and I was just going to make little movies on television every week. Well, that's not television, but I thought it was. And that's how I got the job. Actually, it turns out it wasn't Rosie's job to offer. Rosie had partners. He had 20th Century Fox, he had NBC, which then owned 25% of the show, and he had Fess Parker, who owned 30% of the show. So Rosie was the junior partner. And Rosie and Fess had not been in good terms for a couple of years. Because Fess had perceived himself as being abandoned by Rosie. Rosie was off making movies, not paying attention to television. And now he wants to put his son-in-law in there, you know? So he was suspicious. But my name was the only name that appeared on 2 lists. My name was on Rosie's list, and it was on Fox's list, because Fox knew me. So I was one of 3 candidates for the job. I'm sitting in my office knowing they're discussing what could be the future of my life down the hall, and I get a phone call from Rose and says, "Fess is going to make the decision. He's on his way down there. I hope you know what you're going to. I hope you're prepared," he says. So Fess walked into my office. We sat down. We talked for a while. And I told him all the things I felt about the show. I was honest. Told him I thought the scripts weren't any good. Told him where I thought the show could go, how it could be a better show, how it could be an important show even. And that it was something that I thought I could be passionate about, care about, and that I thought he was good and solid and all the things that I think he wanted to hear and that I believed. And that night I got a phone call, and it was him on the phone, and he, instead of saying hello, he said, "Hello, boss?" And that's how I got the job. And I went to work in March of 1967. Cupboards were bare. There were no scripts to shoot. The show was, I think, 39th in the ratings. It was heavily in deficit. as most shows were at that time. And I took the show over, had a very rocky start, but wound up opening night with a review from, the show had never had a good review. Daily Variety called it a well-crafted oter. I still remember the review. A well-crafted oter. And the show got number 9 in the ratings and stayed in the top 10 or in the top 15 for most of the next 2 years. And I kept it on. The show was only supposed to, I was only supposed to shepherd the show for a season. They all thought, give us enough episodes to go into syndication. When it fails, it's okay. And I didn't fail with the show. I kept it on for a total of 3 years. So I was a big hero for a while at Fox, and it meant a lot to me. It was a great time in my career. And I was sort of the wunderkind of 20th Century Fox. I was 29 years old. I was the youngest producer in establishment Hollywood. And about that time, there came a movie made by 2 kids about 2 young men on motorcycles going across the country called Easy Rider. Made outside the studio system, made with independent money, made with a handheld camera. And it caught the country by storm. And suddenly, the ground on which I had built my fortress began to shake, because the entire studio system began to question its whole reason for existence. Why are we doing this? How can we succeed? How can we compete with these people who are going out with small vans and making movies? And so all the stuff that I had vested my life in, the studio system, being being part of the establishment, being a team player, saving the studio money, knowing how to make a show for a price. None of those things had real value anymore at the studio. They didn't care. They were closing their doors on everything. So when my show ended, I suddenly found myself in a very precarious position. And I didn't understand all of it until only recently I read a book called Easy Rider, Raging Bulls, or Raging Bulls, Easy Rider. I forget which order it was. And it was about that whole period of hiring all these young guys who had no experience. Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, all these guys who didn't know anything and never made anything, but were perceived to be bright, young, talented filmmakers. I was their age. I was a bright, young, talented filmmaker. But I was considered to be old because I was from the old days. I'd learned the old ways. So I was young old or old young, and they were young old, the opposite of that. Right. And therefore in fashion, and I was not. So it was an interesting, very interesting period of my life where it just suddenly, all those doors were closed. Everybody I went to see, it wasn't personal. It wasn't, we don't like Barney Rosenzweig. It wasn't that I'd made enemies. It was that I simply was not in vogue. I was not a la mode. And in those days, you had to be. It was better if you'd never done anything. You were better off being mysterious than you were having credentials. And of course, these guys were talented. Scorsese and Coppola are 2 of the great filmmakers of my generation.
When you were talking about Daniel Boone, you mentioned Fess Parker was in that, and of course he became famous in the role of Davy Crockett. It sounded like it was a good experience. Did it turn out to be a good experience?
It was a fabulous
working
experience.
with him.
I loved working with Fess, and we're friends to this day. I don't see him as often as I'd like because I live in Florida now and he lives in California. But I have been to his home in Santa Barbara. We always embrace. He was at my last wedding, please God, last wedding, and it was a wonderful experience. And I learned a great deal working on that show. And I was very proud of my accomplishment. The show, I don't know if I mentioned, I did mention how well it did, how we got a nice review and how good the ratings were. It became the only non-deficit finance show at Fox. I was not only making the show for license fees, it was at profit in its first run. I learned how to do it. I learned a lot of things that I practiced on Cagney and Lacey years later. But I'm proud in many ways of Daniel Boone in ways that I'm not of Cagney and Lacey, because Cagney and Lacey I was preaching to the choir. The political content, the political and social content of Cagney and Lacey was great stuff. But, my audience were people who were predisposed to believe all that anyway. On Daniel Boone, I was doing the same thing. But I was a hit in Arkansas. I was a hit in Louisville. These people were finding out things that they didn't know about America. And I got a lot of letters saying, "Dear commie Jew bastard," that would begin and would descend from there. But there were, I was talking about civil disobedience. It was the American Revolution. I was talking about, I would say to my writers, and remember we're doing this in the 60s, I said, this is the American Revolutionary times. Treat America like it's Vietnam. The Americans are the Vietnamese. The English are the Americans. Now, give me Brendan Behan's The Hostage and set it in Boonesboro. And that's what we would do. The Boone and his guys would capture a young English lieutenant, hold him as a hostage because the English were doing whatever they were doing to the Americans, and the English general would walk in and say, "Boone, you've got to release this kid. I'm telling you right now, there's a serious debate on the floor of Parliament whether this whole country is worth the life of one Englishman. Don't do this." These were contemporary arguments that were going on in the press then about what we were doing in Vietnam. And I'm saying this stuff to people in America's South. I had a black lead, a sidekick for Daniel Boone. Introduced Yaphet Kotto, Don Pedro Colley, and others into roles like that. Had the first black villain. I did a Nat Turner kind of character on Daniel Boone. I'd say to the writers, do Moby Dick, only it's a bear instead of a whale. We were coming up with stories of character. I think it's an interesting television story to tell, and I'm going to do this now. I got the job on Daniel Boone. And everybody said to me, this show is going to fail. You're just to shepherd it for a year. We hired you because you're the cheapest guy we could hire. If you could get the show picked up, you will be a hero. But understand, nobody expects it to be picked up. And in that atmosphere, I'm working on scripts. I'm trying to figure out what to do. I didn't even understand that the show had to be 46 minutes long. I just was going to make a movie, and I forgot about commercials. And I can't tell you how naive I was when I first got this job, and how I had to figure out how to make these sets work and to make all this stuff, the minimum number of locations we had, actually work. And I had a wonderful team of people working for me who were really looking out for me, as they do for all their bosses. That's their job. And I got a phone call from a predecessor of mine, the guy who worked for George Sherman. Paul King was his name. Paul King was a producer on shows like, or an associate producer on shows like Rawhide, and Matt Dillon, and had left all that to work on, and left television to go back to work at CBS as an executive. He was a personal favorite of William Paley's. And CBS had come out in TV Guide with an interview with Mike Dan, who was then the head of CBS, saying, we are attacking Thursday night on NBC. We can no longer allow NBC to rule Thursday night. We have everything else, but we can't give them Thursday night. And so what we're going to do is we're going to attack the lead-in. We're going after the beginning, because it was Daniel Boone leading into Ironsides, leading into, I think it was Perry Como or Dean Martin show. I think it was the Dean Martin show leading into the night show. That was the Thursday night lineup. And what we're going to do is we're going to come up with double feature night on CBS. It's going to be a 90-minute Western leading into another 90-minute movie of the week, another Western. So it's action night on CBS. Now, up till then, CBS has been doing things like, there have been shows like our competition was things like The Flying Nun, Batman, all these kind of goofy, trendy kind of gimmicky shows. If you wanted to watch, though, a little action drama on Thursday night, the only show you could watch was Daniel Boone. We were operating under the philosophy of contrary opinion. Everybody else was looking at these other shows, but we fit this niche. We were alone. Right. Suddenly, we were going to be confronted directly by the massive force of CBS. And the show they were going to start against us was a show called Cimarron Strip. And I got a call one day from my associate producer telling me that Fess Parker was in a terrible funk, that he had just gone to lunch with Paul King. And Fess was in a major depression because Paul had told him what was going on at CBS with Cimarron Strip. And I called Paul. And I said, Paul, I said, you've ruined my star's day. What's going on? He said, well, I'm sorry. He says, well, I had to be honest with him, Barney. He says, I told him Cimarron Strip is the best show ever made on television. It's cost $350,000 per episode budget, and we haven't made a show for budget yet. Now, I understand Daniel Boone had a $150,000 budget, so you get some idea of the enormity of this thing. He says, it's gorgeous. He says, the music, the this, he says, it's a fabulous show. He says, enjoy your brief tenure as a producer, because you're history. Well, it's devastating news. And I said, well, tell me something. I said, who are you hiring for guest stars? And he told me they were all people I could hire. And then he said, well, I said, who are you hiring for writers? He told me they were people that I could hire. They were available freelancers who I knew or knew of. Who are your directors? He told me, again, they were directors, journeyman, solid people, but I could hire journeyman, solid people. So I thanked him, I hung up the phone, I said, well, where's he spending all the money? And then it occurred to me, horse falls and stunts. I said, the obvious is clear. I cannot compete with him on that level. So I will introvert my show. I will do a show about somebody comes to Boones, the Rainmaker, comes to Boonesboro and changes everybody's life for better, for worse, whatever. Make the show tinier. We assume there are Indians out there. We know it's dangerous out there. Every now and then we'll cut to the stock shot of the mountains will go, and a little smoke will be puffing up, will go bum bum bum, and we'll know they're out there. But we don't have to see them. We'll do this interior. Well, it was a big change, and nobody believed in my process. But the writers were writing good material, and as the writers wrote really good material, I was able to get good actors. Julie Harris did a Daniel Boone. Maurice Evans did a Daniel Boone. I was getting some terrific people to play these wonderful characters that were being invented by very, very good writers. There were problems. Fess's best friend on the show was a stuntman by the name of Ted White. Ted White made $250 a week plus stunts. Under my predecessor, he was making $1,500 a week. Suddenly, there were no stunts. He was making $250 a week. He was an unhappy guy. And he started talking to Fess. He says, you got that fag Jew in there, Next thing you know, he's going to have a Fess walking around the forest with a cape. So Fess got nervous. And he got so nervous that he called Aaron Rosenberg, who he hadn't talked to very much in 2 years, and Rosie came down. What's going on, he said. I told him what I just told you. I told him my theory about Cimarron Strip and what was going to happen. His eyes went heavenward. And he simply said, kid, you might as well die with your own flag flying. Fuck it. We're going to be canceled anyway. And he walked out the office. It's in that atmosphere that I'm making a show. Now, this crew had been together for 3 years on a very good job. Fess Parker gave Easter egg hunts on the set of Boonesboro for their families. Christmas presents and Christmas trees on the set every Christmas. It was a great job. And now I was ruining this for everybody. Show came on the air. We get through the summer. I'm exhausted. I am literally at the end of every day opening the hood of my car to see if there's a bomb underneath the hood. It's frightening time. And I go to my doctor. He says, I'm putting you in the hospital. You're exhausted. I said, you can't put me in the hospital. Shoot me up. I got a show to make. And he was giving me vitamin injections 3-4 days a week. I'm having the nurse come by and shoot me in the ass with vitamin B shots. And then it became the opening night for Cimarron Strip. It was a week before our opening. I sat alone in my rather large office with a large malt glass filled with scotch and ice to watch the show. And there it came in big red letters, Cimarron Strip, and a massive orchestra behind it. Impressive. And then there were 40 dots. 40 dots. On television, 20 horses and 20 riders looked like 40 dots. And every once in a while, you'd cut from the 40 dots to a close-up of Stu Whitman with a scrubby beard going like this. And I knew that next week I was coming on the air with the very, very likable Fess Parker, teaching his 10-year-old son on the movies the Boy Scout manual in close-up. And it was golden. And I watched the show, and I walked out, and my art director, Monty Elliott, and my production manager, Ted Shills, leaned out the door in the hallway and said, "Boss, what do you think?" And I said, "Gentlemen, we are a very large hit." And I went home and slept well for the first time in months. Cimarron Strip was canceled 3 weeks later. The crew of Daniel Boone came into my office, picked me up, carried me on their shoulders around the set of Boonesboro. And Fess Parker said to me, "You're the boss, whatever you say goes." And I said, the place was I was surrounded by spies, people who didn't like me, people who Fess had hired to make sure that I was not Rosie's wart. And I said, "Does that mean I can fire people around here?" He said, "You can do anything you want. You're the boss." And I went down the hallway and said, you, see you later. You're out. You wonder where a guy like me gets the ego to do what he does. That's one of those moments. It's very hard to ever come down from that. And then I stayed there. I made 3 more years of this stuff. I made 78 episodes, and experimented with all kinds of ways of doing it. Introduced Fuad Saeed and his tiny camera crew, his little van, to the studio system. Never been done before. So we were able now to get into areas of Fraser Park and into the Malibu Canyon areas we could never get into before with our big trucks. And so suddenly we have all new locations, looks and stuff for no money. It was a great experience.
So what you just described was not just a way to learn the business of making a TV show, but you truly put your stamp creatively on a TV show, on
Absolutely.
a TV series.
Absolutely, on a show that existed. So it was doubly challenging because I had to take that show that somebody else had created, with all those elements somebody else had done, and that had been going in a certain direction, not unsuccessfully, and change its course. In this case, for the better.
So what happened with Sons and Daughters? Just briefly tell me, that didn't last that long.
Right.
But what happened, and what did you learn from that?
Okay, Sons and Daughters. I was a gun for hire. I had been out of work for a long time. After Daniel Boone, I think I made the realization that things were tough, and I went off. I made one film for David Wolper in Hong Kong, Men of the Dragon, I think it was called, and they were hard times. And I got a job offer to go to Universal to work for a guy by the name of David Levinson, who was a wunderkind at Universal, a protege of Bill Sackheim, who was one of the best producers ever in television. And David had assembled quite an interesting group of people to work on this show. It's a little soap opera show about a bunch of kids from small town America who were in high school and who I had a great affinity for the show because I thought I was one of those kids. I had been the cheerleader in Montebello High School before I was the head cheerleader at USC. I had been popular. I was one of the, I was from the kind of a modest, close to the wrong side of the tracks, but not quite. But I knew the kids who were from the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak. And David was bad casting for this. David was the son of a Jewish doctor in Chicago who spent his days at, at concert halls and piano recitals and libraries, and who was kind of short and not very attractive kid, probably was very unpopular with these kids in high school, probably hated them. which I would certainly understand. But now he's in charge of making a show about them. It was not a pleasant time. And I tried to speak up and tell him, what I knew, not only about television, but what I knew about the subject that we were dealing with. I felt very much identified with the kind of stories, the kind of people who would populate this series.
We're going to change tape.